The £1 million player arrived at Nottingham Forest this morning in his white Jaguar, and Mrs. Trevor Francis was there too. They were met by assistant manager Peter Taylor, and discussions began at once. Manager Brian Clough arrived sometime later, his regular game of squash, the preliminary to the day's talks.
The terrible secret Trevor Francis died with. The truth is finally revealed, but this isn't about some hidden scandal or public disgrace. The terrible secret Trevor Francis carried was something far more human. It was a story of quiet pain, deep regret, and a private battle with grief that was tougher than any opponent he ever faced on the pitch. In February 1979, Trevor Francis became Britain's first £1 million footballer. It should have been the proudest moment of his career. Instead, it became a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. That price tag followed him everywhere. It overshadowed everything he achieved. He won European Cups. He played 52 times for England. He scored goals that made crowds roar. But none of it mattered. Whenever he walked into a room, he was introduced as the first £1 million footballer, as if that was the only thing he ever did. The weight of that price tag was crushing. Francis later admitted that being remembered for a number rather than his talent felt like his entire career had been reduced to a single moment. The figure of £1 million became more famous than the man himself. It was a label he could never escape, no matter how hard he tried. Brian Clough was the manager who paid that record fee, but Clough seemed determined to make Francis suffer for it. The mind games started even before Francis signed. When presenting him with an award in 1978, Clough publicly told him to get his hands out of his pockets. Francis meekly replied, "Yes, sir." It set the tone for what was to come. Clough seemed to think the pressure could ruin a player. What do you think? Is any footballer's talent worth the weight of a record-breaking price tag? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe. Once Francis joined Nottingham Forest, the treatment got worse. His debut wasn't at the famous City Ground. It was for the A-team on a park pitch in front of a handful of fans. When he couldn't play because of cup rules, Clough made him brew tea for the rest of the squad. "These lads are here earning your living today," Clough told him. The humiliation was deliberate and constant. Clough was furious when Francis honoured a previous agreement to play in America. When Francis returned with an injury, Clough refused to play him until the Players' Union stepped in. During one European match, Clough sent Francis to use a public toilet rather than let him into the dressing room for the team talk. On another occasion, he put Francis off the team bus on a remote lay-by after a match, leaving him stranded on the side of the road. Francis was a star player, being treated like a problem child. Clough constantly played him out of position on the right wing instead of his preferred central role. The message was clear. No player, no matter how expensive, was bigger than Brian Clough. Francis was a European champion, yet he felt misunderstood and misused by his own manager. His England career became another source of disappointment. He earned 52 caps and scored at the 1982 World Cup in Spain. But Francis never felt satisfied. In his own words, injuries cost him a number of England caps. The ruptured Achilles tendon that ruled him out of the 1980 European Championships was the biggest blow, but it was part of a constant pattern of muscular problems that needed endless rehabilitation. At age 14, Francis was selected for an England schools trial, but was rejected after the first stage. For a boy who had known nothing but success, it was a psychological blow. He later admitted he never really set himself targets like playing for England after what happened when he was 14. That early rejection created a seed of doubt that never fully went away. The cruel irony was that Francis had all the talent in the world. At Birmingham City, he had been a sensation. He made his debut at just 16 years old, becoming the club's youngest ever player at the time. Before his 17th birthday, he scored 4 goals in a single match against Bolton Wanderers. He finished his first season with 15 goals from only 22 games. Birmingham manager Freddie Goodwin compared him to Jimmy Greaves and Denis Law, two of the greatest goal scorers of that era. Francis possessed explosive pace, quick feet, and an imaginative football brain. His iconic goal against Queen's Park Rangers in October 1976 showed his unique talent. He cut in from the touchline, evaded 2 defenders while being forced backwards. It was breathtaking. He became Birmingham's talisman, helping them win promotion to the First Division in 1972. But as his talent grew, so did his frustration. He was desperate for silverware. He submitted at least 6 transfer requests, all rejected by a board that knew he was their greatest asset. He was a superstar trapped by his own brilliance. He had scored vital goals in the run-up to the final, including 2 against BFC Dynamo Malmo and the opening goal against Ajax. But just before the final against Hamburg, he ruptured his Achilles tendon. He was forced to watch from the sidelines as his teammates won a second consecutive European Cup. The injury changed everything. He was never quite the same player again. That explosive pace, those quick feet that had made him special, were diminished. The golden moment in Munich, that perfect diving header, turned out to be the peak of his career. After leaving Forest, Francis became a journeyman. He moved to Manchester City in 1981 for £1.2 million, but the transfer caused friction within the club, and he left after just one season. He spent 4 years in Italy with Sampdoria, where he played alongside greats like Graham Souness and Roberto Mancini, and won the Coppa Italia in 1985. He then had a year at Atalanta. He returned to Britain to join Rangers in Scotland, winning a Scottish League Cup. Then came moves to Queen's Park Rangers, and finally Sheffield Wednesday. His career also included successful loan spells in America with the Detroit Express, where he was twice named to the league's first team alongside legends like Franz Beckenbauer and Johan Cruyff. The frequent moves and persistent injuries meant he never again found a permanent home or reached the sustained heights of his youth at Birmingham and Forest. His managerial career followed the same painful pattern. At Sheffield Wednesday, he guided the club to both the League Cup and FA Cup finals in 1993. They lost both finals to Arsenal. The FA Cup final replay was decided in the last minute of extra time. It was heartbreaking. He had taken his team to the biggest stage, only to fall short when it mattered most. Francis returned to manage Birmingham City in 1996. Over 5 years, he built a competitive side that challenged for promotion, but narrowly missed out each time. The peak came in 2001 when his second division Birmingham team reached the League Cup final. They took Premier League giants Liverpool to a penalty shootout before losing. Once again, he had reached the final hurdle but couldn't cross it. His managerial career was competent, sometimes excellent, but ultimately defined by agonising near misses. But the real secret, the terrible burden Francis carried, had nothing to do with football. In 1974, he married Helen Alcard. For more than 40 years, she was the rock of his life. She was by his side through every transfer, every injury, every triumph, and every disappointment. Birmingham City called her his rock throughout his career. His quiet, humble personality made sense when you understood that his family was the true centre of his world. In 2017, Helen died after a long battle with cancer. The impact on Francis was devastating. His close friend, broadcaster Gary Newbon, said Francis was devastated by her death and was very lost for a while. The man who had faced down the toughest defenders and handled the pressure of being the most expensive player in Britain was suddenly lost without his wife. Francis admitted the truth in his own words. "Life without her is so difficult," he said. "It's so hard because of the deep love I had for Helen, and also because I am useless in the house. She did everything for me. I don't mind admitting that. All of a sudden, I am living by myself, and I suppose I never contemplated this would ever happen." Then he said the words that revealed everything. "It is a tougher challenge than anything I ever faced on a football field." There it is, the terrible secret Trevor Francis died with. Not a scandal, not a disgrace, but a profound, private grief that was heavier than any price tag, heavier than any injury, heavier than any disappointment on the pitch. He carried the burden of losing the woman who had been his everything. Friends said he was only just, beginning to find happiness again in his final months before his sudden death from a heart attack in July 2023. Yet Francis should be remembered for more than his pain. On May 30th, 1979, in Munich, he scored the goal that won the European Cup for Nottingham Forest. It was a diving header at the far post, powerful and perfectly placed. That moment of brilliance was priceless. Today, a bronze statue stands at St Andrews honouring him as Birmingham City's greatest ever player. His name lives on through the Trevor Francis Schools Cup, teaching young players the values he embodied. Trevor Francis was a trailblazer, a boy wonder who became a man of quiet dignity. He should be remembered not for the price he cost, but for the priceless moments he gave and the humanity he showed in the face of immense personal pain.
I used to play with a little tennis ball against the wall, and I think that's where I learned all the ball control, passing in and out and so on and so on. And I think it's very important for young kids to do that. In those days, things were pretty tough. To get a football, you couldn't afford it. And sometimes we played with a pig's bladder. Used to go to the butchers and say, have you got a pig's bladder? Used to...
That terrifying end headline you just saw and the funeral image burning across your screen are not just sensational packaging, they're the truth about what happened to one of football's greatest legends. Stanley Matthews was called the Wizard of the Dribble. For over 30 years, he played beautiful football. He was famous across the entire world. But this story isn't about his glory on the pitch. This is about what the world did to him. This is about how a system built around him broke him down. This is about the exploitation, the coercion, and the tragedy that followed him from Berlin to Stoke to his final days. Most people remember Stanley Matthews as an untouchable saint of the sport. Clean living, incredible fitness, a gentleman. But that's the story they want you to know. The real story is darker. If you're watching this because you want to understand what really happened behind the scenes, make sure you hit that hype button and give this video some energy. The algorithm needs to know you care about the truth, not just the highlight reels. Now, let's go back to where it all ended, so we can understand how it began. On February 23, 2000, Stanley Matthews died. He was 85 years old. It came after a short illness, but the way he went out was anything but gentle. His funeral drew thousands of people. Supporters came from across the country to say goodbye to the man they thought they knew. And then his ashes were buried beneath the centre circle of Stoke City Stadium. Think about that for a moment. The same club that made him a star, the same place that trapped him, the same institution that controlled his entire life. They buried him there, literally beneath the ground where he played. It was the final twist of the knife. He belonged to them in life, and in death, they made sure he belonged to them forever. That image of his funeral, those thousands of mourners, that's not a celebration, it's a haunting. It's the ghost of an institution that built its empire on one man's talent and then discarded him when he was no longer useful. But to understand the tragedy of his death, we need to go back. We need to go back to the moment when Stanley Matthews stopped being a person and became a pawn. May 14th, 1938, the Olympiastadion in Berlin. The England national football team arrived in Nazi Germany to play a match. But this wasn't just a football game. This was diplomacy. This was politics. This was the British government using athletes as propaganda tools. Stanley Matthews was among the players who walked onto that pitch. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The England players were told to perform the Nazi salute during the German national anthem. Not asked, told. The British Foreign Office had ordered it. The ambassador, Sir Neville Henderson, had pushed for it. He wanted to show goodwill to Hitler. He wanted to prove that Britain respected German strength. He wanted to avoid conflict. So, he turned football players into instruments of a brutal regime. The players resisted at first. They knew what the salute meant. They knew what it represented. But the FA officials told them they had no choice. It was a matter of courtesy. It was necessary to avoid political tension. That was the lie they were told. It was always about the politics. It was always about control. When Matthews raised his arm in that stadium, surrounded by Nazi flags and roaring crowds, something inside him broke. His father, Jack Matthews, had taught him to be straightforward about life. Jack would watch his son play and give him honest feedback. Not praise, not criticism, just truth. Jack once said, "I've seen you play better, and I've seen you play worse." That was the kind of man Jack was. Direct, real. But no amount of his father's realism could prepare Stanley for what happened in Berlin. He was a tool of the state. His body was used to send a message. His presence was weaponized. Later, much later, when Stanley was old, he admitted the truth. He said he deeply regretted what happened that day. He said it was a betrayal of everything he believed in. The weight of it never left him. He carried it until he died. But in that moment, in 1938, he had no power. He was just a player. The state could use him however it wanted. If you think that was the end of his suffering, you're wrong. It was just the beginning. 3 months later, back in England, a different kind of crisis hit. Stanley Matthews was at Stoke City. He was their star, absolutely their star. But something was wrong in the dressing room. His teammates resented him. They were tired of the constant attention he received. They were tired of the fans treating him like he was more important than they were. Media followed him everywhere. The photographers wanted his picture. The newspapers printed his name. His teammates were invisible compared to him. They turned against him. The dressing room became a place of resentment, a city of resentment, as people would later call it. In February 1938, Stanley made a decision. He asked to leave. He requested a transfer. He didn't do it for money. The maximum wage meant money wasn't the issue. Players at that time earned a capped salary. No matter how famous you were, no matter how many fans loved you, you earned the same as everyone else. That was the system. So he wasn't running toward more money, he was running away from the resentment. He was running away from the isolation that came with being too good, too famous, too important. When the fans heard he wanted to leave, they lost their minds. 3,000 supporters packed the King's Hall in Stoke. 3,000. They came together and demanded that he stay. They treated him like property, like he belonged to them. His life was theirs to control. The city erupted. Protests started. The press hunted him down. When he tried to escape to Blackpool for a few days to find peace, even there he found none. Newspapers followed him. The supporters pursued him. There was no escape. The pressure was crushing. After weeks of this harassment, Stanley gave up. He withdrew his transfer request. Not because things had improved. Not because the resentment in the dressing room had disappeared. No, he withdrew it because he was worn out. He was exhausted. He couldn't fight anymore. So he stayed at Stoke City. He stayed until 1947. 9 more years of resentment. 9 more years of isolation. 9 more years of being trapped. This is the tragedy that nobody talks about. Stanley Matthews was treated like property by the people who loved him most. His own city turned him into an object. The fans wanted him. The club wanted him. But nobody asked what Stanley wanted. Nobody asked if he was happy. And when he tried to take control of his own life, they crushed him until he had no choice but to obey. After the war, after all the fighting and the bombing and the destruction, football tried to return to normal. The game was different now. Harder, more demanding. Players were pushed to their limits. Every match mattered. The physical toll was enormous. In 1946, Stanley Matthews faced a situation that few people know about. He admitted, years later in his autobiography, he had taken pep pills before a match. Pep pills were amphetamines. They were stimulants. They made you faster, stronger, more alert, more aggressive. The exact match is uncertain in the records. Some accounts say it was an FA Cup match against Sheffield United. Others say it was a 1946 fixture against Belgium. The details don't matter as much as what it represents. In that era, there were no rules against these pills, no regulations, no testing. Doctors would give them to players and call them tonics, call them rejuvenators, call them medical aids. They were drugs. They were performance-enhancing substances. Stanley wasn't alone in this. Other players admitted to it too. Managers were experimenting with all kinds of things. At Wolverhampton Wanderers, a manager named Frank Buckley was trying monkey gland injections to boost performance. Monkey glands. That's how desperate they were. That's how unregulated the sport was. But here's the thing that makes Stanley's situation tragic. He was famous for clean living. Everyone knew that. He had a special diet. He trained harder than anyone else. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. At least, not publicly. His whole image was built on discipline and purity. And then he had to take pills just to keep up. Just to meet the expectations. Just to satisfy the demands of the sport and the fans and the clubs. The contrast is stunning. The public image of absolute purity, the private reality of pharmaceutical assistance. It shows you something important about sports at that time. Even the best, even the most dedicated, even the ones who did everything right, they still felt the need to use drugs. The pressure was that intense. The system demanded that much, and if you didn't find a way to meet those demands, you would be left behind. But the real shackle, the thing that truly trapped Stanley Matthews throughout his entire career, was the maximum wage. The Football League had a wage cap. No matter how famous you were, no matter how many fans came to watch you, no matter how much money you made for your club, you earned a maximum of £20 per week. £20. That was it. At the absolute peak of his career, with millions of people knowing his name, with merchandise bearing his image, with sponsors desperate to use him, he earned £20 per week. Think about that for a second. He was one of the most famous men in Britain, the most famous footballer in the world, and he couldn't earn enough to live the life his fame suggested he should have. He couldn't become wealthy. He couldn't build real security. He was trapped by the very system that made him famous. Clubs owned the players completely. They controlled where you could go. They controlled what you could earn. The retain and transfer system meant you couldn't leave even if another club offered you more money. You belonged to your club until they decided to let you go. You had no power. You had no negotiation. You had no choice. So what did Stanley Matthews do? He got a side job. He ran a hotel in Blackpool, a guest house. He had to work outside of football just to make ends meet. The greatest footballer in the world was running a hotel to survive. He also did endorsements, Craven A cigarettes. That was one of his deals. Craven A cigarettes. This was in the 1940s and 50s, when the medical world was just starting to understand the link between smoking and lung cancer. Scientists were publishing papers. Doctors were warning people, and Stanley Matthews, the clean living legend, was endorsing cigarettes, not because he believed in them, but because he needed the money. Because the maximum wage had made him poor. It would take until 1961 for this system to finally crack. A footballer named Johnny Haynes became the first player to earn £100 per week. 100. That was the breakthrough. That was when players finally broke free from the wage cap. It came too late for Stanley Matthews. By then, he was at the end of his career. He had spent decades under the maximum wage, decades of struggling, decades of side hustles, decades of endorsing products he didn't believe in, decades of financial insecurity, despite being the most famous footballer alive. And then came Port Vale. In 1967, Stanley Matthews took on a new role. He became the general manager of Port Vale. Maybe he thought this would be different. Maybe he thought management would give him the control he'd never had as a player. Maybe he thought he could finally build something that was his own. He was wrong. A year later, in 1968, Port Vale was caught in a massive scandal. The club had been making illegal payments to players. They violated the strict financial regulations of the Football League and the FA. Suddenly, the entire club was under investigation. The punishments were severe. Port Vale was temporarily expelled from the Football League. The club was destroyed. Stanley Matthews. The fans saw him as the face of the club. The media blamed him. The FA blamed him. He was the scapegoat, but the truth was more complicated. The illegal payments had been happening before he arrived. Other people in the club had made those decisions. People with more experience, people with more authority. But Stanley was the famous one. Stanley was the recognizable one. So Stanley took the fall. He resigned. The club spiraled further into chaos. And Stanley was left with something that added insult to injury. The club owed him wages, significant wages. But the club had no money. The scandal had destroyed their finances. So Stanley never got paid what he was owed. He lost his job and his money at the same time. This ended any hope he had for a career in English football management. It was damaged goods now. His reputation was ruined. So he wandered. He took coaching jobs here and there, went to South Africa for a while. He coached abroad, but he never got back into the English game at a meaningful level. The system that had used him his entire playing career had chewed him up and spit him out. For the rest of his life, Stanley Matthews carried all of this with him. Berlin salute, the transfer crisis, pep pills, the wage cap, Port Vale, all of it. Every betrayal, every moment of powerlessness, every time he was treated like property instead of a person, every time the system took more from him than it gave. And then, in 2000, it ended. February 23rd. He was 85 years old. A short illness, they said. But the real illness was deeper than that. It was a lifetime of being used, a lifetime of institutional victimhood. The wizard of the dribble was dying, and the grace he'd shown on the pitch meant nothing when it came to the common indignities of age and sickness. No amount of clean living could save him. No amount of fitness, no amount of pep pills would have helped at the end. His funeral was massive and attended widely. Thousands came to pay their respects, mourned the loss of a legend, and then they buried his ashes beneath the centre circle of Stoke City Stadium, the very place that had trapped him, the very institution that controlled his life. They put him there permanently, underground, literally beneath the ground where he'd spent his life. It was poetic in the cruelest way possible. He belonged to them in life. He belongs to them in death. That terrifying end at the beginning, that funeral image burning through the screen, that was the culmination of tragedy. Final chapter in one of football's greatest stories. A man who spent most of his life powerless, controlled by governments, fans, and clubs, controlled by systems that saw him as a tool, not a person. Stanley Matthews is remembered as the wizard of the dribble for his longevity, his skill, his clean living. Yes, all of that is true, but he was also a victim, a man whose talent was exploited, whose body was used for politics and profit, whose life was never his own. The systems took everything from him, his freedom, his money, his dignity. In the end, they took his body, burying it beneath the pitch where he'd made them rich. That's the real story of Stanley Matthews, not the saint, not the legend, the victim. A man used by systems that took far more than they ever gave. That's what happened to the wizard. That's the tragedy nobody wants to talk about anymore.
Dashing, he had that mischievous factor about him that always had you on the edge of his seat wondering what he was going to be up to next.
Oh, one of the all-time greats, isn't he? No doubt about it.
Denis Law was someone special. You never get people like Denis Law. He was absolutely, I would think, probably one of the greatest players inside the box.
Denis Law died at 84. The news came on 17th of January 2025, bringing an end to a life that had stretched from wartime Aberdeen to the glittering heights of European football and finally to a quiet battle with dementia. His family said he'd fought hard, but at last he was at peace. For those who loved him, the relief was mixed with sorrow, because the man who had once commanded stadiums with fearless grace had spent his final years watching his own memory slip away. But how did a barefoot boy from one of Scotland's poorest streets become the only Scottish footballer ever to win the Ballon d'Or? Denis Law was born on 24th of February 1940 in the middle of a world war, into a family that knew hunger more intimately than comfort. His father, George Law, was a fisherman, and the North Sea gave and took as it pleased. Sometimes there was food, sometimes there wasn't. The Law family lived in a cramped council flat at Printfield Terrace in Aberdeen's Woodside district. Denis was the youngest of 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls, and space was scarce. So was money, so was everything. The flat was damp and overcrowded, 9 people sharing rooms where privacy was impossible. When his father's fishing nets came up empty, the family went without. When storms rolled in and the boats couldn't launch, there was no income. This wasn't temporary hardship. It was the constant rhythm of their lives, a relentless grind that shaped every decision, every meal, every morning. His mother, Rabina, fought a daily battle of attrition just to feed and clothe the children. He went barefoot until he was 12 years old, not by choice, but because shoes cost money his family didn't have. Walking the rough, cobbled streets of Aberdeen without shoes would have altered his body in ways that later served him well. His feet grew strong, his balance acute, his connection to the ground tactile and immediate. Between the ages of 12 and 14, he wore thin canvas plimsolls that offered little protection from the cold granite streets or the impact of a football. At 14, he finally got his first proper pair of shoes, but even those were hand-me-downs from his older brothers, worn and shaped by someone else's feet. He didn't own football boots until he was 16, a gift from a neighbour named George Geddes who saw the boy's talent and wanted to help. This was the world that built Denis Law. It was hard, relentless and unforgiving, but it also taught him to fight for every inch, to make do with nothing, and to never take a single moment of grace for granted. In the tenements of Aberdeen, survival was the primary measure of success. Everything else was luxury. Without a leather football, which cost a week's wages, Denis improvised. He scrunched up old newspapers into a tight ball, tied it with string or rags, and hung it from the clothes pulley in the kitchen or a hook in the tenement hallway. Then he would jump over and over, heading the swinging paper ball, raising it higher each time. This crude training device became the foundation of his aerial ability. Years later, he would outjump defenders a foot taller than him, timing his headers with a precision that seemed impossible. That skill was born in poverty, perfected in a cramped hallway where hitting the granite walls meant pain. In those narrow confines, avoiding the jagged walls whilst leaping for a swinging target required a spatial awareness that no academy could teach. He was learning to control his body in tight spaces, a skill that would define his penalty box prowess. The technique he developed would become his trademark, the source of countless goals, the reason fans would chant his name. The irony is cruel. The very technique that lifted him out of hardship would, decades later, be linked to the dementia that stole his mind. But Denis faced another challenge, one that should have ended his football career before it began. He had strabismus, a condition where his eyes didn't align properly. One eye looked straight, the other wandered. At Kitty Brewster Primary School, the other children called him Cockeye. The bullying was relentless. He was given thick NHS glasses, heavy and fragile, the kind people called jam jar bottoms, but he couldn't wear them during football. Without them, his vision was chaotic. He saw double, or the ball's path blurred into confusion. So Denis adapted. He closed one eye. He played the entire game using monocular vision, relying on just one eye to judge distance, speed, and trajectory. For most people, this would make timing a volley or a header nearly impossible. Depth perception relies on both eyes working together. But Denis's brain compensated. He learned to read the ball through movement, through the way it shifted against the background, through the size of its image on his retina, through instinct honed by necessity. His brain was forced to over-rely on monocular cues, teaching itself a different way to see the game. When Huddersfield Town scouted him at 14, their manager, Andy Beattie, was blunt in his assessment. He called Denis a freak and said he'd never seen a less likely football prospect. The boy was weak, puny, and wore thick glasses, but the club signed him anyway, and they did something that changed everything. They paid for corrective surgery in a hospital in Aberdeen. For the first time in his life, Denis could see the world through two aligned eyes. He later said the surgery did wonders for his self-confidence. The transformation was immediate. The freak became a predator. By 1962, Denis Law had joined Manchester United for a British record fee of £115,000. He had played successfully for Huddersfield, then Manchester City for a record fee, and then Torino in Italy, where the defensive style frustrated his attacking instincts. The club was still rebuilding from the devastation of the 1958 Munich air disaster, and Law became a symbol of its resurrection. He became known as the king of the Stretford end, not just for the goals he scored, but for how he scored them. He played with a crackling mix of aggression and style, fearless in his willingness to throw himself into challenges that would make modern players flinch. The fans saw in him a reflection of their own lives, the grit and determination of working-class Manchester. He wasn't polished or distant, he was one of them. His style was distinctive. He scored with back heels, bicycle kicks, and diving headers. He fought for every ball as if his life depended on it, because in his mind, shaped by the poverty of his childhood, perhaps it did. He understood what it meant to have nothing, and he played as though every goal might be his last chance to prove he belonged. His background in the Aberdeen tenements showed in his willingness to fight for every ball, often recklessly throwing his body into challenges that spoke of a hunger deeper than sport. In 1964, Denis won the Ballon d'Or, the award for the best footballer in Europe. To this day, he remains the only Scottish player ever to achieve this. He formed the Holy Trinity with George Best and Bobby Charlton, a trio immortalised in a statue outside Old Trafford. Together, they defined an era. Charlton was the stoic English gentleman, the survivor of Munich, the leader. Best was the Irish genius, the pop star, the celebrity. Law was the Scottish warrior, the sharp-witted instigator, the executioner. They represented the full spectrum of British football identity, and together they made Manchester United a force that could challenge anyone. Denis scored 237 goals in 404 appearances for Manchester United, making him the third highest scorer in the club's history. For Scotland, he netted 30 goals, making him joint all-time top scorer alongside Kenny Dalglish. These numbers tell part of the story, but they don't capture the complete picture. They don't show the bravery, the defiance, the refusal to be beaten by circumstances that should have crushed him. But there was tragedy even in his glory. In 1974, playing for Manchester City, Denis scored a backheel goal against his beloved Manchester United. He believed, mistakenly as it turned out, that his goal had relegated United. He didn't celebrate. He walked off the pitch with his head bowed, was substituted immediately, and effectively retired from top-level club football in that moment. "I have seldom felt so depressed," he later said. The king had, in his mind, struck the final blow to his own kingdom. It was a moment that haunted him, a twist of fate that felt almost Shakespearean in its cruelty. As Denis aged, the invincibility of his youth began to crack. In 2003, at 63, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He underwent major surgery to remove the prostate gland and recovered, using his experience to encourage other men to seek screening. A statement from Manchester United at the time noted he was in very good spirits in hospital. He turned his trauma into public service, speaking openly about a disease many men feared to acknowledge. His openness helped countless men face their own health with courage. Then, in August 2016, something more ominous happened. Denis collapsed at Manchester Airport whilst travelling to Menorca with his wife, Diana. He reportedly turned white and told his wife he didn't feel well before blacking out completely in his seat. He was rushed to Trafford General Hospital. He later admitted he thought he'd snuffed it. Doctors diagnosed a vasovagal episode, a sudden drop in heart rate and blood pressure that reduces blood flow to the brain. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it hinted at deeper vascular issues, problems with blood flow to the brain. It was a warning, the first public crack in the granite. In August 2021, the warning became reality. Denis Law announced he had been diagnosed with mixed dementia, a combination of Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. The dual diagnosis was particularly cruel. Alzheimer's attacks memory and thought, caused by the accumulation of amyloid plaques in the brain. Vascular dementia results from poor blood flow to the brain, often caused by tiny, unnoticed strokes or vessel damage. Given his history of vasovagal issues, the vascular component made sense. His body's support systems were failing him, but it was the cause that Denis confronted with raw honesty. "What else would it be?" he said. "That was what caused damage to the brain. You didn't think about it. We just thought it was normal." He was talking about heading. The leather footballs of his era were heavy when dry and became waterlogged, soaking up water like a sponge and turning into rock-hard projectiles when wet. Denis had spent his career perfecting his heading technique, meeting the ball with force thousands upon thousands of times. The skill that defined him, the paper ball training in the tenement, likely destroyed him. His public statement was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I recognize how my brain is deteriorating and how my memory evades me when I don't want it to, and how this causes me distress in situations that are beyond my control." The man who had once controlled space and time on the pitch was losing control of his own mind. He spoke of the long periods of isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic, how the months alone had accelerated his decline. For dementia sufferers, social stimulation is vital, and the lockdowns stripped that away. He retired from public life. He hung up his autograph pen, as he put it. "I hung up my football boots a long time ago, and now it's time to put my signing days behind me," he said. His daughter, Denis Law, became the public face of his battle, raising money for the Alzheimer's Society and offering glimpses of the good days and bad days. She organised fundraising walks, including the Thames Bridges Trek, turning her father's suffering into a force for awareness and change. In November 2021, a statue of Denis was unveiled in Aberdeen. He attended the ceremony, flanked by Sir Alex Ferguson. It was his last major public appearance. He stood smiling, immortalised in bronze, even as his flesh and mind faded. On 17th of January 2025, Denis Law passed away at the age of 84. His family statement was simple but heavy with meaning. "It is with a heavy heart that we tell you our father, Denis Law, has sadly passed away. He fought a tough battle, but finally he is now at peace." His funeral, held on 11th of February 2025, was a state occasion for football. The funeral procession began at Old Trafford. The hearse arrived at 1:10 p.m, driving slowly down Sir Matt Busby Way before stopping at the Holy Trinity statue. Denis was the last of the three to die. George Best in 2005, Bobby Charlton in 2023. The moment allowed for a spiritual reunion in the shadow of the stadium they had built together. Thousands lined the streets. Flowers, scarves and tributes carpeted the forecourt. Flags flew at half-mast. As the procession moved, Flower of Scotland played, a haunting reminder that though Denis was Manchester's king, he was Scotland's son. For a man who had left Aberdeen at 15 but never lost his accent or his identity, this was a poignant tribute. The service at Manchester Cathedral was attended by the elite of football, including Sir Alex Ferguson, visibly moved, and the current United manager, Ruben Amorim, bridging the gap between Law's history and the club's present. The eulogies spoke not just of the footballer, but of the man, his humour, his kindness to staff, his devotion to his wife Diana. Denis Law's life is a story of triumph and cost. He rose from barefoot poverty to win the Ballon d'Or, playing with one eye closed, heading paper balls in a tenement hallway. He became a legend, the king of Old Trafford, adored by millions. But the game took its price. The heading that made him great likely caused the dementia that unmade him. His death serves as a sombre reminder of the human cost of glory. He joined a tragic list of 1960s icons, including Nobby Stiles, Jack Charlton, Martin Peters, and Ray Wilson, all of whom suffered from dementia. Their brilliance came at a price the sport is only now beginning to acknowledge. When he died, Denis Law was released from the confusion of a deteriorating mind. He left behind a legacy that cannot be diminished. The boy with the squint became the best player in Europe. The barefoot child walked among kings. The tragedy of his end does not erase the triumph of his life. It merely makes him human, and he remains forever the king of the Stretford End.
What can you say about Ronnie Moran? Legend really doesn't do itself justice. A man who gave over 40 years service to Anfield. Most Liverpool fans remember Ronnie Moran as this loyal leader to the likes of Shanks, Bob Payne.
He ended up as the Liverpool captain and very, very consistent and a tough guy.
Tragic truth. He gave 49 years of his life to Liverpool Football Club, but in the end, Ronnie Moran was forgotten, sidelined by illness and lost to a disease that may have been caused by football itself. The man who shaped legends died while losing his own memory. The coach who terrified superstars spent his final years unable to remember their names, and the captain who deserved glory watched others lift the trophies he earned. This is the story of the most loyal man in football history, and the cruel price he paid for his devotion. Ronnie Moran was born on February 28, 1934, in Crosby, Liverpool. He joined Liverpool Football Club in 1949 at just 15 years old. But this was not the glamorous academy system of today. Moran did not live in luxury apartments or train full-time. He worked as an apprentice electrician for the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board while playing for Liverpool's youth teams. Football was a trade, not a ticket to fame. Players lived in the same neighbourhoods as the fans. They drank in the same pubs. They faced the same money worries. Moran earned £14 per week during the season and £11 in summer when he turned professional in 1952. That wage kept him connected to reality. It taught him that success was earned through hard work, not given through talent alone. This philosophy would define everything he became. The electrician's mindset stayed with him forever. He saw football like wiring a circuit. Every connection had to be perfect. Every wire had to be grounded. One loose connection could blow the entire system. And complacency was the short circuit that ruined everything. But Moran's early playing career was not spent in glory. He made his debut in November 1952 in a 3-2 defeat to Derby County. Liverpool were relegated to the second division in 1954. Between 1955 and 1959, Moran became the club's first-choice left-back. He was consistent, reliable and tough. He even took penalties. By the late 1950s, he was made club captain. But here is the tragedy. He led Liverpool during their lowest point. The club was stuck in the second tier of English football. They were mediocre, they were forgotten, and Moran carried the weight of that failure on his shoulders. This experience shaped his psychology forever. He knew how fragile success was because he had lived through the wilderness years. He knew that one moment of laziness could send you back into the darkness. That fear of failure became the engine of his coaching. It made him the man they called Bugsy, and it made him impossible to satisfy. Then Bill Shankly arrived in December 1959. Everything changed. Liverpool began their rise. Promotion was coming. European glory was on the horizon. But for Ronnie Moran, the 1960s were not a fairy tale. They were a nightmare of bad luck and cruel timing. In the autumn of 1960, Moran suffered a serious injury. In those days, sports medicine was basic. Recovery took months. Rehabilitation was rough, and if you lost your place in the team, you rarely got it back. Moran's injury gave Jerry Byrne his chance. Byrne had been on the transfer list. He was considered a reserve team plodder, but Shankly saw something in him. Byrne played the remaining 33 league games of the 1960-61 season. He never looked back. Moran recovered and fought for his place. He played 16 games in the promotion season of 1961-62. He missed only 7 games in the 1963-64 title-winning season, but the shirt was no longer his. Byrne was younger, tougher, and more physical. Byrne was the granite pillar of Shankly's defence. Moran was the loyal backup, the experienced voice, the professional who never complained. Then came the cruelest moment of all, the 1965 FA Cup final. Liverpool had never won the FA Cup. For a man like Moran, who had suffered through the second division years, lifting that trophy at Wembley would have been everything. But injury struck again. Jerry Byrne took his place, and Byrne became a legend that day by playing most of the match with a broken collarbone. Liverpool won 2-1. The city celebrated, and Ronnie Moran watched from the sidelines. 3 days later, Moran was recalled for the European Cup semi-final first leg against Inter Milan. Liverpool won 3-1 at Anfield. Moran played his final competitive game in the return leg at the San Siro. Liverpool lost controversially. It was a bitter end to his playing career. He was denied FA Cup glory by injury. He was denied European glory by a referee's decision. The captain of the hard years never got his moment at the peak, but Moran did not sulk. He did not complain. In 1966, Shankly invited him to join the coaching staff. Moran entered the boot room, the small storage area at Anfield, where Liverpool's coaching staff planned their domination of English football. And this is where the legend of Bugsy was born. The nickname Bugsy came from the American gangster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. In the underworld, Siegel hated that name because it meant he was Bugs, slang for crazy or unpredictable. Ronnie Moran hated the nickname too. He saw himself as a professional maintaining standards, not a lunatic screaming at players. But the name stuck because it captured something real about his intensity. Moran could moan for England. That was not an insult. It was his job. In a team winning trophies at an incredible rate, complacency was the biggest enemy. Moran's role was to be the bad cop. While Bob Paisley was the tactician and Bill Shankly was the motivator, Moran was the enforcer. He was the sergeant major who kept everyone grounded. Even after a 5-0 win, Moran would find something to criticise. He believed praise made players soft. Criticism kept them sharp. The stories are legendary. After Robbie Fowler scored 5 goals against Fulham in a League Cup tie, Moran entered the dressing room and said, "I do not know what you are looking so smug about. You should have scored 7. Fowler expected celebration. Instead, he got recalibration. That was classic Moran. Raise the standard immediately after success. Never let ego creep in. Steve McManaman described Moran as a constant voice in his ear during training. Stay out wide. Get chalk on your boots. Moran barked orders relentlessly. McManaman said it drove him crazy at first, but later he realised Moran was teaching him positional discipline. If McManaman could not get the ball, his positioning created space for teammates. Moran was not just shouting for effect, he was shouting geometry. Jamie Carragher credits Moran with identifying his future as a centre-back when Carragher was just 18. Beneath the moaning was an astute, tactical mind. Moran could see what a player would become before they saw it themselves. He was not cruel, he was precise. Moran managed the training ground at Melwood with an iron fist. He was responsible for physical conditioning. Liverpool became the fittest team in England under his watch, but this relentless grinding came with a cost. It wore down the players, and eventually it wore down Moran himself. The trophies piled up: 13 league championships, 4 European Cups, 5 FA Cups, 5 League Cups. Moran was part of every single one as a coach. He worked under Shankly, Paisley, Fagan, Dalglish at Saunis, and Evans. Managers came and went. Moran stayed. He was the constant, the heartbeat, the engine room of the boot room. But in February 1991, everything collapsed. Kenny Dalglish resigned as Liverpool manager. The club was in shock. Dalglish had been exhausted by the emotional toll of the Hillsborough disaster and the pressure of management. 2 days after a chaotic 4-4 draw with Everton in the FA Cup, he walked away, and Ronnie Moran was thrust into the role of caretaker manager. Moran did not want the job. He said so explicitly. He was a coach, not a figurehead. His strength was the training ground, not the media spotlight. But someone had to steady the ship, so Moran stepped up. He led the team for 10 matches. The results were erratic. They lost to Luton Town immediately after the resignation, but they also demolished Derby County 7-1. They lost the FA Cup replay to Everton 1-0. The team was grieving. Moran was left to absorb the impact. Critics said Moran was too old school. They said he was resistant to change. But that criticism ignores the context. Moran was trying to maintain continuity while the club's greatest modern icon had just walked out due to stress. He was holding together a broken squad with loyalty and discipline. He was doing what he always did, protecting the system. In April 1992, Moran was called upon again. This time, the circumstances were even stranger. The new manager, Graham Souness, required triple bypass heart surgery. Souness was in hospital. Moran had to manage the team and face the media. But then a controversy erupted that alienated the entire city. Following the FA Cup semi-final victory over Portsmouth, a photo of Souness kissing his girlfriend in the hospital was published in the Sun newspaper on April 15th. That date was the 3rd anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster. The Sun was reviled in Liverpool for its false reporting on Hillsborough. For the Liverpool manager to appear in that paper on the anniversary of the tragedy was seen as an unforgivable betrayal. Moran was stuck in the middle. He was the acting manager on the ground. He had to shield the squad from the toxicity engulfing the club. He was a local man who understood the city's grief, but he also had to remain loyal to his boss. It was an impossible position. Moran, as always, absorbed the pressure without complaint. He led the team to the 1992 FA Cup final against Sunderland. Souness was present, but frail, sitting largely inactive. Moran conducted the team. Liverpool won 2-0 with goals from Michael Thomas and Ian Rush. For Moran, this was profound closure. In 1965, he had missed the club's first FA Cup win due to injury. In 1992, he finally led the team to victory at Wembley in the same competition, but the triumph was tainted. It was achieved under the shadow of controversy. The team was ageing. The boot room magic was fading. Moran's moment in the sun was clouded by the realisation that the club he loved was entering decline. Ronnie Moran retired in 1998 after 49 years of service. He was the longest-serving employee in Liverpool's history. He had given his entire adult life to one institution, but his post-football life was consumed by tragedy. In 2012, Moran was diagnosed with vascular dementia. This condition is linked to repeated head trauma. The footballs of Moran's era were made of leather. When wet, they became significantly heavier. Heading those balls repeatedly is now suspected to cause micro-concussions that accumulate over decades. Paul Moran, Ronnie's son, provided a heartbreaking calculation. If he headed the ball 5 times a day for 50 years at Melwood, it works out to something close to 100,000 times he has been hit in the head. 100,000 impacts, 100,000 microtraumas. Paul said, "I do not want it to be caused by football." He hoped his father's incredible life in the sport was not the architect of his demise. But the evidence is hard to ignore. Many of Moran's contemporaries, including Ron Yates and Tommy Smith, also suffered from dementia. This suggests a systemic occupational hazard rather than isolated bad luck. By 2016, Moran's condition had deteriorated so much that the family moved him into a care home. 24-hour care was necessary. The man with a photographic memory for tactics, player errors, and training routines could no longer grasp the present. The disciplinarian who controlled every aspect of Melwood was now dependent on others. Ronnie Moran passed away on the morning of March 22nd. 2017. He was 83 years old. The immediate cause was a chest infection and pneumonia, but the underlying condition was vascular dementia, the disease that may have been caused by the very thing he loved most. The reaction to his death was enormous. He was not just a former player, he was the last of the boot room. Joe Fagan, Bob Paisley, and Reuben Bennett had all passed before him. Moran's death severed the final living link to the Shankly era. His legacy is often measured in trophies: 13 league titles, 4 European Cups, 5 FA Cups, 5 League Cups. But his true legacy is the culture he enforced and the price he paid to maintain it. Moran was the bad cop who allowed others to be the good cop. He absorbed the negativity, the friction, and the resistance. He converted it into competitive energy. There is a tragic symmetry to his life. As a player, he was the captain who laid the groundwork for promotion, but was injured just as the team reached the summit. He watched Jerry Byrne take his place for the greatest triumphs. As a coach, he was the architect of the dynasty's fitness and discipline, but was forced to take the helm only when the dynasty was collapsing. He bore the brunt of transition without the stability he had built. In retirement, he gave his mind and body to the sport for 49 years, only to have his mind betrayed by the very activity that defined his profession. Ronnie Moran never lifted a cup as captain, but he helped every other captain lift theirs. He was the heartbeat of Liverpool Football Club for nearly half a century. His story is one of immense professional glory, underpinned by personal sacrifice and quiet tragedy. He accepted the nickname he hated because it served the team. He stepped aside for Jerry Byrne without complaint. He cleaned up the mess after Dalglish resigned, and he paid the ultimate physiological price for a life spent on the training ground. In the history of English football, few figures have given more of themselves to a single institution, and few have borne the weight of that service with such stoic dignity. Ronnie Moran was not just a coach, he was the last sentinel of a golden age. And when he died, an era died with him. The modern game has no place for men like Ronnie Moran. Today's coaches are celebrities. They have agents, media teams, and personal brands. They chase the spotlight. They demand credit. But Moran worked in the shadows for 49 years. He never sought fame. He never wrote an autobiography. He never appeared on television talking about his achievements. He simply served. That selflessness is what made Liverpool great. The boot room was not about individual glory. It was about collective success. Every coach knew their role. Every coach stayed in their lane. And Ronnie Moran was the guardian of that system. He made sure nobody got too big for the institution. He reminded everyone that the club was bigger than any individual, even when that individual was himself.